Hi, everyone. This is Joni McGarry. Thank you so much for tuning in. Perhaps you've noticed that I haven't had a podcast episode in many weeks. We had some construction here in our house, and I had a lot of travel that I had to do, so I took a bit of a break. To my delight and surprise, I had many emails from people who were wondering where the episodes were, telling me they missed them, and asking if I was going to continue the podcast and encouraging me to do so. And I have to tell you that that pretty much thrilled me and made me very happy. So thank you so much for that feedback. I appreciate it more than you know. Today I have with me Colin Elliott. He is a professor of history at Indiana University here in Bloomington, where I live. His specialty is ancient Roman history, and he has an interest in money, disease, and ecology of ancient Rome. He is an award winning professor, a terrific orator, and a really talented storyteller, and the author of a few books. His current book that he's working on is called Gladiator and Tyrant Commodus, Last Emperor of the Pax Romana, excuse me. And it's a biography of the Roman Emperor Commodus, who was deeply flawed. And in that book, Colin will examine how his character flaws and his failed leadership really led to a crisis point after centuries of prosperous and peaceful leadership in ancient Rome. So we'll look forward to that coming out. Today, we're going to talk about another book of his called Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World. And it was published in 2024, Princeton University Press. And it is a wide ranging, comprehensive account of the world's first pandemic, the Antonine Plague, which was AD 165 to 170s. And Colin was approached to write that book in March of 2020. And we talk about the experience of researching the ancient plague, the ancient pandemic, while the current pandemic was unfolding all around us. And he has some interesting things to say about that. And he also has another book called The Economic Theory and Roman Monetary Economy. He is the host of a weekly podcast on Roman history on Spotify called The Pax Romana. And I am a huge fan of that podcast. It got me through a 14-hour drive in which I was stuck in traffic recently. There are 20-minute episodes. At the end of each one, you cannot wait to listen to the next one. It's like a cliffhanger. It's so entertaining and so informative. Again, if you have time for one podcast, that's the one I would recommend, and I'll put it in my show notes. I'm happy to talk to Colin today. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. So without further delay, I welcome to the podcast Professor Colin Elliott. Welcome, Professor Elliott. Colin, it's so good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks very much, Joni.
I was so delighted to have you as our featured speaker at the Brownstone Midwest Supper Club recently. And since then, I have discovered your amazing podcast. I think I might be your biggest fan. And I'm going to put it in the show notes. And if you only have time for one podcast, pick this one. It's the Pax Romana. And it just takes you through the history of the Roman world and in 20-ish minute episodes, and it's riveting and wonderful, and it's like watching like a cliffhanger. So I just love it. So thank you. I wanted to talk to you today about your book and a couple other things, but your book, The Pax Romana, which is the plague that shook the Roman world. And it is about the Antonine Plague. And I just will let you tell us what that is, how you came to write that book, what you've learned. Let's just jump into that. I'm starting to read it now, and it is as riveting as your podcast. You're an excellent storyteller. So take it away, Colin.
Thanks so much, Joni. And wow, thank you for your generous comments. I really feel like, as a historian, my job is really just to explain what's there. And I do think that Roman history is interesting. I mean, I went into this profession because I found the stories very captivating and interesting as an undergraduate student at the University of Oregon. And here I am still talking about ancient Rome. So yeah, you mentioned the book. So the book that I published last year, and I think they got a paperback edition now that's out, if folks want to pick that up, it's a little bit cheaper than the hardback. But so that's about something called the Antonine Plague. And when, um, I don't know, about 4 years before our big pandemic, so when we were in, I don't know, 2016 or so, I started learning about this mystery disease that hit the Roman Empire in the years of Marcus Aurelius, this very famous Roman emperor, very well regarded Roman emperor, but who experienced a series of crises. And one of those crises was a disease outbreak. And historians have really been puzzled about this disease because there aren't a lot of great sources for it. It's a little bit of an enigma as to whether it was some far-reaching pandemic-like disease, or on the other hand, if it was almost made up and not really much of a problem at all. So there are all these controversies about this disease and what effect it had on the Roman Empire at the time, because the Roman Empire under Marcus Aurelius was at the end of a string of decades of general prosperity. It was a time in which there really was not a person alive that could remember a civil war or a foreign war that went badly. The travel across the entire Mediterranean was relatively easy. Trade was bringing in goods from not only anywhere within the Roman Empire, but from places far beyond, from places as far away as East African coast, Indian Ocean, China, even silks from China were coming into the Roman Empire. So it was a really interesting time. And then this disease maybe was very bad, maybe it wasn't. And so I started looking into this question. And then I got approached by Princeton University Press, who ended up publishing the book in March of 2020, because, well, there was this, little pandemic thing that seemed to be, fizzling into view, and maybe people would be interested in ancient pandemics, even though this thing was probably going to blow over. And so I started writing the book on the Antonine Plague. No one had written a book about this plague,
Oh,
really.
that seems so early for them to have contacted you. That's very interesting that they thought,
Yeah, I
"Well,
mean,
this
I
could
think
turn into something. Let's look at the ancient history."
right, and I think that, that's a good sign, and Princeton has been, just let me say briefly, they have been a really wonderful partner for me. They're really interested as a press in talking about kind of, this sounds weird, but like cutting edge ancient research. So they're really interested in books that bring into the foreground kind of the most cutting edge research on the ancient
Mhm.
world that might also have contemporary relevance. So they seem to be really good at kind of putting their finger on the pulse. So it's not like they knew that COVID-19 would become this big, huge thing,
Right.
but they certainly were prescient in sort of realizing that, yeah, disease would be a major topic. And so, so I started writing this book on the Antonine Plague, and boy, was it wild to write a book about the world's, first recorded pandemic during a pandemic. It was pretty crazy. And, because of a lot of what happened during COVID, much of it not related to the actual disease, which, as was itself not all that bad. I mean, when you look at the actual seroprevalence studies and all of that, which for some reason was very difficult to access during the pandemic, if you believed anything other than that this disease was the worst disease ever. For some reason, nobody wanted to hear that. But
For
in
some
reality, this
reason.
disease for the vast majority of the population was of no more severity than the kind of annual flu viruses that
Right.
circulate around. I mean, if you were over 70, you definitely needed to be more careful, but everybody else was really not ever at some kind of substantially increased risk. But anyway, the point is the reaction to that, to the COVID-19 pandemic, really got me thinking more about what was the reaction like to this ancient pandemic in the Roman Empire. And was that really more of the story than the actual disease itself? And Pax Romana, the book that came out of this, I think threads that needle, where it is a book about a disease for sure, and how this disease entered the Roman Empire, and all of the what maybe it was and how many people it killed. But I'd say the main story of the book is what happens when a disease that nobody had ever heard of and nobody could cure suddenly is there, and people panic, people get scared, and how do human beings react? And so there are certainly some things that are different about the Roman reaction to their pandemic, but there are also some things that are uncomfortably and kind of frighteningly the same in the way that humans reacted then and the way that they reacted in the past few years.
What would be some of those things?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the big difference. Uh, so, well, maybe it's not actually that big of a difference if we explore it. But for the Romans, disease is not a medical issue. Like they don't really think that way. So they're even the doctors um, would ascribe religious causes to diseases, and so any part of good disease prevention has to do with proper respect towards the gods. That's
Mm,
crucial. And so what that means, what it means if a disease strikes a city or strikes a region, what that means is some god somewhere is not happy.
right.
And if a disease strikes the entire Roman Empire, which is largely what happened with the Antonine Plague, then there must be some real problems with the religious sphere. And so what the Romans are mostly interested in doing is, sure, you've got doctors like the Greek physician Galen, trying to find sort of medical cures, but there's also this obsession with religious innovation. Like the big question is, do we need to press harder into the traditional worship of the traditional gods in traditional ways, or are there new things that we need to do religiously to fix this disease? So that's quite interesting. And I think the thing that's the same is this sort of spirit of dogma. So the
Mm,
Romans, a good number of them, just sacrifice harder, right? That's what, it's like mask harder. It's like we can't, if we admit that our entire worldview about the gods and what causes disease, we can't imagine a world where that's not really true. So it must be that we're just not sufficiently sacrificing. We aren't looking for the right scapegoats. We need to persecute harder. We need to sacrifice more. We need to erect more statues and all of that kind of thing. And, there's a similarity there because you could have, during COVID, again, if you had the eyes to see it, you could very easily see the pre-existing studies on, say, masks,
mhm.
that surgical masks. There was a study, and I forget which journal, it was maybe 2016, widely available, that showed that among nurses, and I think it was an Australian study, that showed that among medical professionals, surgical masks had really no effect whatsoever on the spread of aerosolized influenza.
Virus. Yeah.
Right. Right. It didn't make any difference whatsoever. You had language, and I'm pretty sure it was the Lancet early on, calling masks a talisman. But it,
Mm,
it mentioned, and this was even the view of Anthony Fauci, as
mhm.
everybody remembered early on. He was on national television saying that, masks are not really going to do much. They're mostly just for show. And then for some reason, everybody changed their tune almost overnight. I think it was around June or July of 2020. And suddenly, if you did not wear a mask at the exactly prescribed times, you were a heathen, right? And I'm
Mhm.
using religious language on purpose. And the rituals became more and more elaborate and weird. Like when you walk into a restaurant, you must put on a mask, and then you
Right.
must walk to your table with the mask on, and only after you've sat down may you then remove your mask, or with airplanes. In the airport, while people are spread out and walking around, you must wear your mask. But then on a plane, you must wear your mask. But when the
Mm,
peanuts come out, then you can take off your mask
right,
because for
right.
some reason the gods of
Mm,
the virus respect you when you're eating. Like it was dogma. And so, in that sense, there were some interesting similarities. It seems like human beings in all times and places will find orthodoxies and
mhm.
heresies very quickly and use those to kind of find out, who's responsible for the sickness, who are the bad guys, and who are the good guys. And the Romans did that, and of course, we did that as well in 2020, 2021, 2022.
Now, while you were writing it and you were seeing or researching it and you were seeing the spiritual response or the religious and the dogmatic response in ancient Rome, was that informing your view about what was happening right in front of you? Or did you already see it and like both, like they were two shoes of the same person, right? So you would see something happen in real life, and would that inform your research or vice versa? Or did you have the same view on both fronts?
Yeah, it was so the I did a lot more. I wrote a lot more than what appeared in the book because there were some days where I would sit down to write, and the latest crazy thing was happening. This day it was, the governor of Michigan suddenly prohibited people from buying seeds in the store, or
Right.
some kind of, it's just weird things. And so I'd
Something
sit down.
seemingly unrelated to the
Right,
thing.
but
Yeah,
for
like
some reason, that's
craziness.
the ritual that we're adopting today to make the
Right.
the plague demons go away. So I'd sit down to my computer every day, and it's especially in 2020, it's like every day there was some new weird thing. And sometimes I would just kind of write about that. I would find
Mm,
myself not really writing about Roman history. I was just writing about how wild this was. And and then, maybe another day I'd go back and look at that, and I'd look at something, a source that I was looking at and be like, okay, I was really writing about what's happening to me now, but actually there's something here going on at kind of a human level. There's nothing contextually the same, but there's sort of a principle here that I didn't see before because I had kind of written something out about what was going on in the present. So they were kind of cooperating, and I had very good editorial help from Princeton people, from the referees that read the book, who I didn't get the impression, agreed with my view on the pandemic, but nevertheless were very judicious about looking at what I had wrote and said, well, look, if you want this book to be about the Antonine Plague and not COVID, you need to rephrase some of
mhm,
this or these sorts of things you need to take out. And, I didn't feel like that was censorship or anything like that. It was actually pretty wise advice, and I'm glad that I followed it. But I do think that this book is obviously a product of sort of COVID and post COVID, where we have become way more aware of the kind of broader social and cultural and economic effects of a disease, and where we're aware especially that sometimes those effects may even outweigh the actual damage
mhm,
from the disease itself. And I think COVID was one of those cases. And the Antonine Plague, I think,
mhm.
also was one of those cases. So to me, now this disease is way worse than COVID, the Antonine Plague.
Yeah, tell us more about it and, what evidence you found that like, how could you were able to identify what it was or at least get close to that? Because
Yeah.
of
So this disease. So again, I go back to the mystery. You have some historians that think that this disease killed 30% of the population, and you have some historians that had thought this disease may not have killed really anybody. It was just sort of a likely kind of exaggerated by the ancient writers that wrote about it. And so this was already a very controversial topic. And when I started looking into it, I mean, I saw on the one hand, you have the writers. The
Mhm,
writers are writing as though this is a very serious disease, but the archaeological evidence was just not there to suggest that, millions and millions and millions of people died. We would just expect to have seen, all sorts of things. Now, mass graves, we would have expect
mhm.
to have seen, all over the place. We would have expect to have seen, widespread evidence of economic disruptions. Um, we do see some of that, but it is particular to certain regions. So there are a few mass graves, but they aren't on the scale of what you'd expect to see with millions and millions dying. They're on the
Mhm,
scale of like, yep, there was definitely an epidemic in Rome, and we can see some bodies that appear to be from that. There appears to be an epidemic outburst in Great Britain. We can see some bodies associated with that, but they're mostly limited. These pieces of evidence, the actual archaeological evidence, the coin evidence, that is mostly limited to cities.
Mhm.
and limited to sites where people were very close together. So army camps,
Mhm.
quarries, mines, those sorts of places. So anywhere where people were gathered and were in close proximity to each other, there's evidence of disease outbreaks and deaths from disease. And what that looks like, especially, is for the graves, individuals in the peak of their age. So not
Right.
children, not elderly. That's a sign of endemic disease. That's a sign of a disease that's already existing and and having high infant and elderly mortality. But a disease that's new is going to hit everybody, including people who are most resistant to disease, which is typically people in their prime. So that was evidence. That's evidence of a disease outbreak. In Rome, there's like a stoppage of coin minting in the year that the disease hit that city. So I mean, that looks like probably disease related. But the other thing that's happening too is there's a resumption of several wars at this time. There are some other economic problems that are occurring. So there's a boatload of evidence, and there's noise in the signal as well. And part of the my job in writing this book, and what had made it so that nobody had probably written a book about this before, is there's so much noise in the signal that it really takes a lot of work to sort it out. And in the end, I came down with the view that the urban evidence and the evidence from military camps should be taken seriously, that this disease probably did kill maybe 10%,
Mhm.
15%
Wow.
of those populations. But the Roman Empire, despite its amazing cities and its huge military, was still largely an agricultural empire. That is, 80% of the population live in relative isolation. They live on small farms or in small settlements. And so they didn't really experience whatever this disease was, because it shows an impact on densities, on densities
Right.
of people. So even if 20% of the people died who were in cities and military camps, that is still like, I don't know, 1% of the population dying, or 2%, which is not small, but it's not the Black Death. It's not a smallpox
Mhm.
epidemic. So in the end, it was not a disease on the scale of the Black Death, but it was a new disease. It hit cities, which is where elites lived and where they wrote. So that's
Right.
why the written sources are so intense. That's why they just talk about death everywhere, because yeah, for those elites that were writing, who normally could escape regular diseases. They could go, they can afford to travel. They can go out to country villas. They can leave the city of Rome anytime they want. They couldn't escape this disease very easily. It lingered around, and it really scared them. And so, because elites were scared, we have a record of this disease in the literary sources.
Do you think, there was a like, when you say there's so much noise in the signal, is part of that noise because the people writing it writing about it at the time were scared, and so were motivated to sensationalize or to direct the population in a certain way? I'm thinking about how the press covered COVID in this age, and then, will somebody later look back on this and say, "Wow, it's really hard to suss out what happened here because the sources are so different."
Right. And
Right?
yeah, I don't have good evidence for this. Maybe you do, but I'm sure that people have written about this. If you think about social class and COVID, I mean, my experience in rural Indiana was a lot of the kind of working class people around me they were not that worried about this
Right.
virus. The people that were worried about it, though, were the middle class people that I knew, the upper middle class people that I knew. They were really, really scared. And I don't know if that sort of socio-cultural phenomenon with COVID has been sufficiently studied yet, because did we have so much terror among the chattering classes because they were the ones that were also the writers, right? It's
Right,
the people that were
right,
most scared were the ones writing, for the New York Times and the Washington Post
exactly.
and all of that. Whereas if they would have just ventured out into the counties around them and met with rural people, I think they would have had a very, when we moved out to the countryside in India, we just suddenly everything was normal again. It
Right.
was just not, people who went to Florida, from California, it was like, oh, I guess. everything's okay. Like,
Good.
we actually don't have to live like we're prisoners for,
Right.
for a year. And so for the Romans, yes, to go back to your question, I do think the fact that these elites became scared created a lot of noise in the signal. Like they're writing about the entire army being killed, and that's part of what they're doing. But also, elites are importing their morality and their religion into the narrative as well, and that's providing noise. So, for example, um, there is a general under Marcus Aurelius, a guy named Avidius Cassius, who ended up betraying Marcus Aurelius. He was not faithful to his emperor. And so part of the way that elites deal with this betrayal is to find some kind of retribution, some justice towards this guy that rebelled against Marcus Aurelius. And so what they do is they write about this general who was leading a war against the Persians in at the time of the plague. And they say, well, look, this general let his soldiers ransack one of these Persian cities, and they were so undisciplined that they destroyed a shrine of Apollo. And Apollo is a deity associated with plague. And when the very first most ancient of sources, Homer's Iliad, mentions Apollo sending down plague uh, because of sacrilege. So this is like a very ancient phenomenon, even to the Romans, hundreds of
Hmm.
years for them. And so the elites come up with this story that Avidius Cassius had this shrine desecrated. And because he was that sort of person, that's the thing that made the gods so mad. And so the mass death and all of this is Avidius Cassius's fault. They
Okay.
do the same, by the way, with Marcus Aurelius's son, whose name is Commodus. He was played by Joaquin Phoenix in the Gladiator movie.
Ah.
And Commodus is a bad guy. Commodus is a tyrant. And Commodus, the gods are not going to be very happy with Commodus. And so when writers write about Commodus, they really play up a disease outbreak that happened under him in Rome, in part to show just how upset the gods were with him. And by the way, how cowardly Commodus was, because what did Commodus do? He fled the city of Rome during the disease. He did not show leadership, but instead he
Mhm.
kind of went on quarantine. And this is
Ah.
a sign of cowardice, according to the Romans. Interesting, maybe commentary there.
So what you're saying is, there's evidence of disease in certain places. There's a lot of noise in the signal, partly because of the way and the people who were writing about it and the way they were telling the story.
Yeah.
And yet, your take is that it wasn't a plague, there wasn't, huge mass death everywhere in the kingdom, but it changed something, and it
Yes.
seems to have exposed some fault lines in the republic and in the empire. It's an empire, right? I mean,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
clearly an empire, and exposed some fault lines. And was it sort of a pivotal moment? Like, did this outbreak, whether it was a real pandemic or whether it was really deadly, whatever it was, it drove something downhill for the Romans.
Yeah,
And what
that's
did
right.
you learn about that?
Yes, this is kind of a subtle point that's hard to miss. I think the more facile argument is, okay, disease occurs, the disease itself causes the problem. And I'm not saying there's nothing there, but it's multifaceted. What's going on, in my view, is that the disease strikes and it does have direct effects. But the broader effect is the kind of panic and the and just the reaction really to this
Mhm.
disease. What this disease does, and you put it really well in your question, is it sort of accelerates things that were already starting to go wrong. So the Roman food supply, for example, is driven by the Roman imperial state. In order to provide food for over 1 million people in Rome, the Roman state has this huge network of ships and dock workers and uh, transporters and imperial estates and taxes and tributes, and a lot of this is state managed, or at least there are kind of state enforced rules to sort of expropriate this grain and transport it and get it to Rome and feed it to people for free. So there's
Wow,
this
this
whole
sounds a little bit familiar, but,
yeah, right.
who knows?
So there's this whole kind of coercive element in
Mhm.
the Roman food system. Now, on the one hand, this ensures that grain, at least in theory, in huge amounts make it to Rome. On the other hand, this has huge market distortions, and it really restricts the ability of any grain market to flourish and to respond dynamically to supply and demand issues, like whether it's caused by economic factors or just like nature. I mean,
Right.
as an agricultural economy and pre-industrial, the Roman Empire is subject to the vagaries of weather. I mean, this is like droughts play a huge role in the Roman grain supply, and because so much of the Roman state grain was coming really from three places, and especially Egypt was sort of the primary place where that was coming from. And much of the state apparatus was focused on Egypt. Well, if there was ever a drought, it's like diversification with stock portfolios, right? If you've got all your eggs in one basket and there's a problem with the basket that your eggs happen to be in, there's suddenly going to be some suffering. And so with Egypt, there's a series of droughts right before the Antonine Plague hits. And what this means is that there are grain shortages
Mm.
in Rome because the Egyptian supply is failing, and so much of the state apparatus is dependent upon Egypt being reliable. And so you got malnutrition in Rome.
Ah.
A lot of that state grain also went to the military. The military are not citizen soldiers anymore. They're not farmers, during part of the year and soldiers. They're professional soldiers. So they're fed by the labor of other people and through expropriation. So if those grain supplies suddenly are threatened, which they were in the kind of decade before the Antonine Plague, well, that creates malnutrition in the cities and among the soldiers. Now, maybe that can be dealt with under normal conditions. But now, if you have a disease that suddenly shows up that starts killing people,
Mhm.
not only field workers and others, but starts hitting the cities, those people are already malnourished. Their immune systems are weakened, and
Mhm.
those people are going to suffer more mortality and than they otherwise would have had been more of a kind of dynamic food supply situation where maybe the prices for grain go up, but people could still get access to it. So you have these grain shortages that are suddenly exacerbated by the Antonine Plague. At the same time, you have weaknesses in the labor market, uh, Roman quarries and Roman mines, which are largely state operated or at least contracted through state contracts. Again, you lose a few workers in those operations. Suddenly, the mines can't be run. They flood because they're underground, and it's very difficult to unflood those mines with ancient technology. You've got Archimedes screws to kind of do a little bit of it, but you in some of those mines just never recover. That's what the archaeological evidence shows during the 160s and 170s AD during the time of this plague. So the plague itself is one of the causes of all of this, but it also just sort of widens these cracks that
Mhm.
were already there in the Roman economy because of its kind of imperial tax and tribute kind of coercive system. It just couldn't handle the stress. It did not have the kind of market economy that could respond dynamically to this disease.
Mhm.
I mean, if you can kind of liken it to hospital capacity. I mean, I sent off so many op-eds, Joni, in the first like month of COVID, and none of them got published, but a lot of them were about like healthcare capacity. Like if this disease is as bad as everybody says it is, why do we have a healthcare system in the United States that is so state oriented, that
Mm.
is so bureaucratic and run by these giant, you know, insurance companies? Like we need a system that is far more dynamic and is able to respond more flexibly to supply and demand. And we don't have that kind of system. And that to me was like a glaring problem,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And obviously the Romans have a far more kind of state driven system.
So when you were writing about how top down and how massive and unable to pivot our systems are, just a question like, does the way you look at the current moment in the world, is it informed by your study of Roman history, or is it somewhat organic as well? Because I
Well,
find that when I've listened to your work on that podcast, all of a sudden things start looking a little different in real time to
yeah.
me. And it's wonderful. It broadens your lens through which to see the world.
Yeah, that's really true, and it is true. We take it for granted, and we sort of it's like a, I don't know, just a throwaway saying, but history really does help us understand the present. It
Yes.
doesn't give us a map. It doesn't tell us exactly what to do, but history is about human beings, right? Ultimately, natural history is about nature, and that's very predictable, and you can replicate those processes in a lab. But human beings are way more dynamic, and they're understood through what Max Weber called Verstehen, understanding. Like, you have to look at the stories of the past of human beings to kind of apprehend the kind of sheer randomness and the way that we make decisions. But in studying the decisions of human beings, we can understand a little bit more what might be happening in the present and what might happen in the future. So, for example, with Roman history. So, to go back to our pandemic, what I saw when we were talking about doing lockdowns, what I saw immediately as a Roman historian was a return to a pre-industrial economy. The inherent benefit of the modern economy is um, the kind of free movement or relatively free movement of peoples and goods. And obviously, we can have nuanced debates about immigration and tariffs and all of those
Hmm.
things. But generally speaking, everybody in the present, I think, enjoys the benefits of relatively open trade. This
Hmm.
is overall, I think, a very good thing to be able to exchange and trade and have money and all of these things. This is something that has brought immense benefits, and the Romans don't have that. They have a pre-industrial economy where, yes, in the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire is more open than it had ever been, but it's nothing like a kind of modern uh, capitalist
Hmm.
society, right? And so um, that created for the Romans a situation in terms of with disease, where you have these pockets of diseases that don't ever engage with each other unless like an army crosses over and back, or
Hmm.
traders cross over and back. And with the Antonine Plague, that's what happens. You get an army going over into Persia, you get traders going back and forth, and somehow between all of that, a disease that was not in the Roman Empire finds its way in. None of that population had the disease, so the disease spreads and it kills some people. So when we went into lockdown in the modern world, we're thinking, okay, this will help us defeat the disease. But we don't really want to go into lockdown because that creates huge
Hmm.
economic hardships. It it negates all of the advantages of economic freedom. And we don't want that. And
Yeah, especially for the people at the margins and the people
exactly.
who aren't really stacked on the top, and we're still feeling the effects of that today. And who knows in 20, 50, 100 years how we'll look back on what kind of cracks that opened.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and the other nice thing, I'm forgetting her name. She was the third signer of the Great Barrington Declaration from Oxford.
Oh,
I forget her
Gupta,
name. Gupta.
Sunetra. Yep.
Sunetra Gupta. Sunetra Gupta made this point in an interview early on, and she was saying, look, on the one hand, globalization does lead to greater spread of disease. At the same time, it also increases our immunity to those
Yes.
diseases
Yes.
because just throwing away the question of vaccines for a second, but just natural immunity, which for some reason became a conspiracy theory
Mhm.
suddenly during COVID. Like, this is like a normal thing. Like, this is a legitimate thing that as diseases spread throughout a population, there is a period of of intense virulence,
Mhm.
but eventually those populations develop a tolerance for those diseases, and we move on,
Right.
and we sort of reach a status where
Mhm.
that disease no longer causes us problems,
Right.
and many people have immunity to it, and it doesn't have these wild epidemic effects anymore, and that's a good thing.
Right.
And when we were locking down, it's like, do we really want to go into these little um uh like, imagine
Pods.
lockdown was effective for a second and we could isolate ourselves. Do we really think that COVID was going to go away? And this was the point of Anders Tingel, I think his name was, the Swedish epidemiologist, who said, look, you can lock down, but eventually you have to come out. And all
Right.
this will do is delay the inevitable. This is not really a realistic strategy. In the meantime, you're causing collateral damage by returning to a pre-industrial state where people are not able to trade and move around, and the economy is not able to create the kind of the innovations and all these things that are going to help combat a disease and offset the indirect costs like poverty and malnutrition and all the other things that happen.
Hmm.
So I was thinking about all of this when we were going into lockdown. It's like, we do not want to voluntarily go back to a pre-industrial situation. If anything, we need to press harder into movement. People need to go out. Young people need to go out and live their lives because they're not going to get affected by this disease.
Right.
And that was very clear early on. And that was the whole point of the Great Barrington Declaration, focused protection. Those people who had high risk, they could stay back for a little bit, let the disease move through the population
And
that is
become
not at
less
all affected.
virulent. Yep.
Right. And where the death rate is lower than the seasonal flu. And then when those people come back in, they're coming back into a population that, even before vaccination, has a level of immunity that is going to make it so that that disease is unlikely to spread back to the elderly people. It was a very sensible, reasonable strategy that again would have been seen as textbook
Public health
defense
response.
against
Yeah.
a disease in a global era that
Hmm.
suddenly was not tolerable. And it's like, as a Roman historian, you're just thinking, why would we do this?
Well, we could get into that, but that gets down a different rabbit hole.
Yeah.
How did the Romans respond? You said that they stopped minting coins. Why was that sort of just they didn't have the people to do it because there was sickness in Rome, or was that a decision for some economic reason that they did that?
Yeah, so the why of this is unknown, and we have to speculate a little bit. So we have some data from a coin hoard, largest coin hoard of Roman silver coins ever found. It's called the Recca Devnia hoard. It has 82,000 Roman silver coins, and that gives us a sample size of coins so that we can look at the coins in that hoard, categorize them by year. And what we see is in the year 167, which is the year immediately following the outbreak of this disease in Rome, there's this like two-thirds drop in coin production that year. Um, we also know the plague hit Rome in that year. So, but those are the two bits of evidence we have. Everything else is sort of speculative. What we can see in comparative evidence when we look at disease outbreaks that are pretty significant in other ancient cities, public business essentially shuts down on its own. It's not something that
Not
there
state
has to be like
mandated.
there's not like an edict or something. I
Mhm.
mean, maybe there was, but we don't have a record of it. But what happens is people flee. So
Mhm.
people flee the city. So that might include mentors. It might include coin workers. It might include people that would spend the coins. Um, People are obviously dying, a lot of state resources. And we do know this, state resources were mobilized to just deal with the bodies in the city,
Mm.
to police the way that people were disposing of bodies. So, and the Roman state has limited resources, limited capacity. So it could be that what happens is just coin minting becomes sort of an afterthought that year,
Oh.
in order to sort of deal with the various crises. So you have that going on, but most of the other things that are happening in response to the plague are religious. So what we really see is, on the one hand, the kind of pressing into the old I mentioned earlier. So you've got statues being erected of
Mhm.
Artemis, who has a bow and arrow that she can shoot at the disease. Statues being erected of Artemis. Um, uh, and sacrifices and sacred rites in various cities to try to expiate the disease. But then the other thing you see that's a little bit troubling are sort of scapegoating rituals
Ah,
as well. So looking for people who are not worshiping Artemis or who are not worshiping Apollo and finding those people, exiling them, those sorts of things. We even see some novel religious innovations. So there's a guy named Alexander who is in Asia Minor, and he's kind of a cult leader. And he has, I mean, this tells you how kind of ridiculous people can get when they're panicked, but he has like a pet, a fake snake, like a sock puppet snake. And the sock puppet snake tells him, secret words from Apollo that, well, if everybody just puts some magic words, on their doorposts or they wear them on a necklace around their neck, they will become immune from this scary new disease. And a ton of people do this. So we
wow.
find like plague necklaces all the way over in Great Britain. We see inscriptions that have his magic words in them in Asia Minor. So people sort of adopt these novel cures. Now, the main source that writes about this guy, Alexander, mentions that there were two groups that were totally uninterested in these plague cures. One was the Epicureans, the other was the Christians. The Christians were not going to worship these gods. They were not going to put magic words, on amulets or whatever. They pressed into what they knew best, which at the time was charity, helping people who were sick, burying the dead. The Christians really stood out during this time as people who were willing to kind of press in to actually caring for those who were unwell instead of fleeing the cities or dumping the bodies wherever. And I think that won the Christians a lot of respect from some, but from others, they weren't participating in the rituals. And we
Right.
know that the rituals work, even though the rituals aren't working. But it must be that we need to do the rituals
Ritual
harder. And
harder. Yes.
yeah, and here's this group here in the cities, because Christianity was primarily an urban phenomenon at this point. There are only about 50,000 to 100,000
Mhm.
Christians in the entire Roman Empire, but they're highly visible in the cities. So you could see the Christians not doing what they were supposed to do. And boy, what do you do with these people? And sure enough, you get some of the most significant persecutions in the entire first 2 centuries AD happening at the time of this plague and just after.
Wow, that's very interesting. And
Yeah,
it's like we think in the current day that we're just so much smarter than that and we're so much more sophisticated. And it strikes me as you're telling these stories that there's nothing new under the sun. The time is flying during our talk right now, and I just want to get to a couple other things.
yeah, sure.
And so you have to come back on when you're not recording your fabulous podcast.
Yeah.
Um, so, in the end, how long does it seem like this plague lasted? And when Rome came out of it, or what was it afterward versus before? Like, how did it change the republic and its trajectory?
Sure. So the disease lasts at least 10 years at its
Mhm.
phase where it was most noticeable. Now, maybe it lingered around for a while. Who knows? But from my view, I don't see a lot of evidence for it after about 172 to 175. So it goes from 165 to around, at the latest, maybe 175. There are some other epidemic outbursts that may be related to it, maybe not. It's tough to tell. And then in terms of like changing things, yeah. So culturally, I think one of the big changes is for the first time ever, Romans realized that disease can strike anytime, anywhere. And they were obviously aware that their empire was large. They were aware of the empire even as a kind of commonwealth more than an empire. But I think that they began to really see religion as a kind of global phenomenon. So rather than trying to focus on and sort of appreciating the diversity of the Roman Empire, which had been very tolerant of
Mhm.
many different religions in many different places, you get these increasing impulses to syncretize religion, to find a kind of common religion for everybody, whether it's the worship of the sun. Uh, One emperor after the Antonine Plague tries to get everybody to worship a meteorite. He was a crazy emperor. His name was Elagabalus. People can look him up for
It's
some
got a
wild
great
stories.
name. That's a great
Yeah,
name.
he's pretty messed up. He only ruled for 4 years and he got murdered. Uh, anyway, so you do get these this kind of new thinking of like religion as kind of more singular and more global, and then
Yes.
also, as I was alluding to before, there's this increasing effort to find dissidents, to find people who are not adequately worshiping the gods or the kind of the god, or who are not sufficiently loyal to the edicts and the desires of emperors. And again, Christians are kind of the main culprit in there. So that's part of the changing of trajectory, but also just economically. Um, these fissures that get exposed from the grain supply to problems with trade, currency. So as the mines, for example, are closed down or are not able to be reopened, suddenly there's not enough silver to mint the
Mm.
Roman coins, and the needs of the state. The state, shocker, but the state decides that they should not be more austere with their spending.
Oh,
Um,
goodness, why would they be?
Right, right,
No state does that.
right. So instead, what they try to do is to extend the money supply. So they don't have enough silver to mint coins. So what we're going to do is we are going to spread the silver that we have even more thinly. We're going to debase the currency, put more copper in the silver currency. And, this eventually leads to some monetary destabilization. And when the monetary unit cannot be trusted anymore, there is inflation.
Mm.
There is a return to barter. There are all sorts of economic problems. The soldiers become grumpy because they're getting pay increases, but it doesn't matter. The pay increases aren't keeping up with their costs. And in
Right.
the end, they start rebelling against emperors. And you get a period after the Antonine Plague of about 50 years in which the average reign of an emperor is only 18 months. So you
Wow.
get, yeah, the reigns of emperors going from, 15, 20 years to 18 months.
Because the
So,
people
and
are
the
mad.
military ends up basically taking over Roman
Mm.
society. Now, not all of this is attributable to this pandemic, but the pandemic is this kind of catalyzing event that
Mhm.
sets a lot of this in motion, or at least accelerates forward a lot of these unstable forces that maybe the Romans could have handled if they would have not have gotten them all at once. But
Mhm.
it's just too much for this kind of agricultural tribute-based economy and a slave-based economy as well to handle.
Mhm. The debasing of the currency is interesting, because, we just basically printed a lot of money during COVID,
Right.
to enable, and I think there was a broader agenda with that, but,
Oh, yeah.
it results in the same thing. Your money's worth less. People are, going to get angry about that at some point. So after you said it ended in like it was in the 170s?
170s, yeah,
And then Commodus came in, and,
yeah,
I just wanted to just touch a little bit on him. You're writing a book, The Gladiator and the Tyrant, is that what it's
yeah.
called? And he is the son of Marcus Aurelius, and if he sounds like not a great guy.
Yeah, so Commodus is a really interesting character, and you're right. So the next book is a biography of Commodus, which for some reason he's a very understudied person, and maybe because he's such a villain. But yeah, I've been looking at him, and I think there's an interesting connection to the plague. Like he's a natural person to talk about in this conversation because Commodus is an Antonine plague baby, you might say,
Mhm.
in the same way that we have these kids now, and I'm seeing them in my classroom,
I'm interested in that too,
who
yeah.
have been affected by 2 years of so-called e-learning. Um,
Mhm.
and you can see it. You can see it, and it's very abrupt in the students that had this. And I hope that those students are upset because this was done to them. I mean, they are in many ways victims of their parents and their grandparents' paranoia. But so Commodus is kind of has a similar situation where he's born in 161 AD, and the Antonine Plague hits when he's about 4 or 5 years old, and it's going on for 10 years during his most formative years. And his we have letters from his dad, Marcus Aurelius, and his teacher, and they're very nervous about health, and they're constantly talking about health and the loss of children. Commodus loses 9 of his siblings, including his twin brother.
Oh,
In
wow.
who know we don't know how, maybe disease, maybe other things, but it seems to me that this is a guy whose parents were terrified, and they really inculcated a kind of climate of fear in his family and in his setting. He was terrified. Cowardice is described by a Roman senator who knew him, named Cassius Dio, as a coward, as
Yeah.
a person who completely lacked any kind of courage or bravery. And when Marcus Aurelius abruptly died, Commodus was only 19 years old, and he gets thrust into power as this frightened, you know,
Traumatized kid.
yeah, exactly. And as a result, he sort of rules that way. He's ruling out of fear. He's not a proactive leader, and he gets he's very suspicious of people, and and this is kind of why perhaps he becomes this gladiator. It's a way for him to project machismo, to go into the arena and slay animals that are drugged, and uh, people that are bound up and
Mm,
tied down, and it's a way to kind of for him to kind of overcome this intense fear. But of course, fighting in the arena is not ruling when Rome is reeling from all sorts of crises, because all of these effects of the Antonine Plague and the economic problems and the debasement, all of that is raging while Commodus is in the arena, fighting as a gladiator. And it's like the worst leader at the worst possible
mm,
time. And in the end, the Pax Romana crumbles and it never comes back.
mm.
And Commodus is a part of that story.
It's interesting because we don't think about, like, you talk about his traumatizing childhood and just coming from a place of fear. And we had all these kids who were locked down and who suffered and loss and come out of that, I think, traumatized. I mean, I think some kids did fine, but I'm interested in what you see in the university. Like you mentioned, that you can really tell that these kids they lost learning. Did they lose socialization too? And do you think that that is going to constellate out in a generation that has some, I hate to say deficiencies, but has some real challenges?
I think there are two groups that I see. One is unfortunate, but one is I'm very optimistic about. So on the one hand, yes, when we all came back, when the university began holding regular classes again, I immediately noticed that when I would walk into a room, that room, even if there were 120 students, was silent. Before the pandemic, I'd always have to get my classrooms to be quiet because we're going to start the lecture. Hey, we're going to start. Hey, everybody, how's it going? And everybody would kind of take like, 10, 15 seconds for everybody
Yeah,
to kind of finish. That doesn't happen. Especially, that's largely not a thing, even
it's
in most of
still,
my classrooms. It's
still.
starting to come back this
Oh,
year a little bit, but for several years, that just didn't happen.
that's so
Nobody talked.
sad.
It
That's
is.
so sad.
It is. Nobody talked. And, you can see it too, and maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but you can see it too in the way that even people dress. Like, people come to university like in their pajamas because I think their world is online.
Yeah,
They're
I know.
not really.
I've noticed it in our town. Like if you go to Target, every single college kid is in pajamas.
Yeah, because I think, and again, I don't really know, but I'm just speculating. But I wonder how many of their interactions are really just online, and you're
Yeah,
only going to dress up after you've kind of vetted somebody online, and then it's like it's like a play date, right? It's like when I was a kid, we didn't have play dates. We just
went
you
out.
played in the neighborhood, right? You
Yeah,
met who you
yeah.
met, and you did what you did, and I feel like now, it's like play dates. That's what you do with kids, and I wonder if these college students are kind of recreating that, where the kind of casual encounters in the hallway and in the classroom are deprioritized in favor of, okay, I've met somebody online, I've got their snap or whatever it is, and then I'm going to go, actually have a formal kind of arranged meeting with them. So, and then I see it too with just the writing. So you can tell, especially, so I really disincentivize the use of artificial intelligence in my
Thank
classroom.
you.
And as a result, I think I get a lot of authentic student writing, and it is not at the level that it has been in the past. And I
Mhm.
suspect that has a lot to do with so-called e-learning. And I've had to go back even in some of my classes to just going over what I would see as like high school level writing, which is a new thing for me. I've never had to do that with
Mm.
university students. Now, I did say there was a second group.
Yeah.
Um, I also think that there is a group of students, and I meet these students, and I'm really excited when I meet them and I see their work. These are students that have had more temptation and more opportunity to kind of lose their character. They've got easy access to pornography. They've got easy access to drugs and alcohol. They've got easy access to the online world. They've got easy access to artificial intelligence, and yet they have not done those things or have been able to stop doing those things, despite the fact that nobody would know. And in fact, the culture in many ways would encourage them
Sure.
to engage in many of those things. So these people have impressive fortitude. They're being bombarded with a level of temptation that no previous generation has. And
Right.
voluntarily, because they desire their own self-improvement, to have be people of integrity, have voluntarily been able to say no to those things. I tell my students, I'm glad I didn't have artificial intelligence. I can guarantee you that at me as an 18 or 19-year-old, I would have had trouble with that, just
Sure.
knowing my own character and my own faults. Um, and that there are students that I have in my classroom that are writing their own assignments, that are studying well, that are sociable, that come to my office hours, that I see talking with other students. Those students, man, they are going to be incredible. They are going to be amazing leaders. And I hope that I live a long time so that I can see those students take over the world, because they have tremendous potential. I think they're a minority, but I'm very optimistic about those students in particular.
So that's so encouraging to me, and it's almost like they're almost forged by fire in a way,
Yes.
because the world is so the world really is trying to turn them the other way. What do you make of? What do you think creates a student like that? Like, do this group of kids, do they have something in common? Are they from a certain kind of family? Do they, is there anything you can say? Yeah, this is probably why they're like that.
Um, I I don't know if I can say much. Like, some of these students I talk to do have what I would call kind of a strong family background. Like, they have parents that they have really good relationships with. I'm thinking about students even that I've encountered in recent weeks who have talked to me about their family and about their parents, and not so much that their parents are necessarily wealthy, but that they have a tight relationship with their
Mhm.
parents.
Mhm.
So that does seem to be something, but I can definitely say that other students that I've talked to that I would put in that category, I know for a fact maybe don't have the best I can think of a student, that I've encountered recently, who, has a really difficult family background. And yet this student, again, has sort of shown just this voluntary level of resilience and integrity that is very, very impressive. Some of them are first gen college students, some of them
Mhm.
aren't. So it's tough to say, but I do think that there are students that have, had a shared experience. They had their proms taken away from them. They had their athletic events taken away from them. They had, they recognized some of the lies that were being told. And they also have listened to some of the voices that have been cautioning against easy access to some of
Mhm.
these other
Mhm.
things. And so they kind of they have a shared story in that. And I think again, that is very encouraging and very
Mhm.
exciting. I have a lot of optimism for those people, and I very much hope that they can create an amazing world.
Wow, that is, that was worth the whole conversation for me. I love it when somebody is seeing that kind of thing in today's world because it's easy to doom scroll and to think, all is lost because, again, these things are so insidious to our
Yeah.
young people, and, so I'm glad you're seeing some of that. Before we wrap, I want to, and again, you have to come back because there are so many other questions I would like to ask you, but just generally, given your knowledge of the ancient world and how you navigate the world, do you have any advice for people on how to live a beautiful and meaningful life in this age of chaos? How do you navigate the forces that are coming at us all the time because it's rapid fire now with the way the media is and everything is immediate. So, how do you live that good life? Because I suspect you do, knowing what I know of you.
Um, well, I mean, less of this maybe comes from my knowledge as a historian and more just from my life experience. But I mean, I have benefited very much from a very supportive family. I encourage young people, if they are interested in ever hearing kind of my personal thoughts, um, family is so important. I mean, the kind of the world that I was in when I was younger was very much like you need to go find yourself. You need to go, you know, um,
You need to leave home, go
yeah, leave
far.
home and
Yeah.
all that. But man, as I've gotten older, it is good to know where you're from and to have a connection to where you're from. One thing I see in history, especially in Roman history, the Roman mob, this very destructive force in the city of Rome that was used for all sorts of political malfeasance, from riots to violence to coups. That mob was formed in large part out of people that did not have a strong identity in a place and in a family.
Mm,
These were people that came into the city of Rome and were desperate. And so I think having a place, even if you go away for a time to university or whatever, knowing where you come from, loving where you come from, loving the people that have helped you, acknowledging that, I think can ground a person very well. And the online world, um, you know, creates this illusion of belonging, but it is actually very superficial.
mhm,
And I think human beings are still creatures of place. We're creatures of relationships, and I think making sure that that people cultivate meaningful relationships, meaningful connections to places, can have a huge role in building resilience against memes and trends and outrage and all of these cycles of enthusiasm and eccentricity that seem to be terminally online. So
mhm,
that would be a big part of it. I'll just say one other thing in terms of the ancient world. I'm not myself one of these sort of neo Stoics or anything like that, but I do think that Marcus Aurelius did have some wisdom in that he said that it was very wise to live a life in which you did not um, try to overly avoid pain and you did not try to overly pursue pleasure, that you tried to live a reasoned life where you really reflected on why you wanted something or why you wanted to avoid something, and you were a little bit more accepting and willing to seek to understand what was happening to you and think about it rather than just react to it immediately.
mhm,
And I think that is helpful advice in the present age, where again it's very easy to draw very quick conclusions or find tribal affinities or these sorts of things, when really reflection is very valuable, and history, if I may say, provides a great place for reflection. So reading history is a great place to go to.
Well, I love it, and, reading your books, I think, I'm finding your book, Pax Romana, very accessible. and of course, your podcast, wonderful. And we'll look forward to your next book. Um, 'Cause I agree with you. I think that if you understand history or look to history when something's happening in current world, it gives you a just a sharper lens and a little bit of perspective. So, thank you for that. It just was wonderful advice. Before we break, just tell us where we can find you online, and then I'll put your other things in the show notes, and we'll hope to talk to you again. So, where can
Sure.
we find you?
Yeah, so if folks want to, follow me, I am on, what was formerly called Twitter, I guess. It's called X. It's been X for a while. I'm not a big fan of X, but, so I'm on there at Prof CPE. There's nothing earth-shattering in my Twitter feed, but people are welcome to follow me and interact with me through that. And then in terms of, like, catching, my podcast, so as you said, Joni, that's the Pax Romana podcast, which is available anywhere you can get podcasts. And then if you wanna pick up the book, if folks wanna do that, that's Pax Romana, Pox Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World, which is available in hardback, paperback, and then folks can look for my next book on Commodus. We don't have a print date for that yet, but I'll submit the manuscript at the end of middle to end of next year, and then probably be out in 2027 or so.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Thanks. And with the podcast, I recommend starting at episode 1 so you can
Absolutely.
follow the history as a
Yeah,
trajectory. Thank you, Colin, for coming on. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I hope we get to talk again.
absolutely. Thanks, Joni.
Thanks.